Two young men are sitting on a rooftop in Pasadena, California, playing drums under the stars. One is 27 years old, an ex-Marine with a face that looks like it's been in a few fights. The other is 19, skinny, with a nose that casting directors will spend years telling him to fix. They're playing congas and bongos, trying to sound like Marlon Brando, who they've heard plays music in clubs. They have no idea that in 47 years, they'll finally make a movie together. They have no idea that together, they'll win 4 Academy Awards. Right now, in 1956, all they know is what their classmates just voted them. Least likely to succeed, Gene Hackman puts down his conga sticks and looks at Dustin Hoffman. "You believe that shit?" Dustin shrugs. "Maybe they're right. Maybe they're wrong." Dustin picks up the rhythm again. "So what do we do?" Gene stares out at the lights of Los Angeles in the distance. Somewhere out there is Hollywood. Somewhere out there is everything they've ever wanted. And somewhere in between is a wall that everyone keeps telling them they'll never climb. "We prove them wrong," Gene says. "That's what we do." It would take 47 years, but they did it. The Pasadena Playhouse in 1956 was one of the most prestigious acting schools in America. Founded in 1917, it was the official state theater of California. Its alumni included Raymond Burr, Robert Preston, and Eleanor Parker. Getting accepted was an achievement. Getting kicked out was a death sentence. Gene Hackman arrived at the Playhouse in the fall of 1956, 26 years old and carrying more baggage than most students twice his age. He'd served 4.5 years in the Marines. He'd seen China during a civil war. He'd worked as a doorman, a furniture mover, a shoe salesman. He'd tried journalism at the University of Illinois and dropped out. He was older than his instructors expected, rougher than they wanted, and nothing like the leading men they were trained to create. Dustin Hoffman arrived the same year. He was 19, fresh from Santa Monica City College, where he'd been studying medicine and music. He'd taken an acting class on a whim because someone told him, "Nobody flunks acting." He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. What he did know was that the moment he stepped on stage, something clicked. "It was the first time I could ever concentrate," he would later say. "The first time in my life." Gene and Dustin met in their first month. They recognized something in each other immediately. Not talent. The Playhouse instructors would tell them they had no talent. What they recognized was hunger, desperation, the willingness to fail publicly, repeatedly, painfully, rather than give up on the only dream that mattered. Gene was 27 and I was 19, Dustin would recall decades later. We used to play congas together on the roof, trying to be like our hero Marlon Brando. Brando was everything they wanted to be. He'd transformed acting with A Streetcar Named Desire. He didn't look like a movie star. He didn't act like a movie star. He was raw and real and completely unlike anything Hollywood had seen before. Gene had watched that film as a young man and walked out of the theater telling his father he wanted to be an actor. Dustin had studied Brando's technique obsessively, analyzing every gesture, every pause, every breath. On that rooftop in Pasadena, they played their drums and dreamed of being the next Brando. They didn't know that the instructors downstairs were already writing them off. The Pasadena Playhouse used a grading system from 1 to 10. Movement, interpretation, gestures, voice projection, attitude. Gene Hackman received a 1.4, the lowest score the school had ever given anyone. "I think the highest I ever got was a 1.4, Gene said in a 1984 interview. He laughed when he said it, but the laugh was hollow. Some humiliations stay with you forever. After 3 months, the school made a decision that had never been made before. They expelled Gene Hackman. The official reason, not having talent. Dustin Hoffman would later explain what really happened. He was so natural, they didn't think it was acting. They couldn't see what he was doing. He was that good. The irony was devastating. Gene Hackman was so talented that people thought he had no talent at all. His naturalness, the very quality that would make him one of the greatest actors of his generation, was invisible to instructors who were looking for theatrical performance. They wanted actors who acted. Gene Hackman simply was. But in 1956, none of that mattered. Gene Hackman was expelled. And before he left, the Playhouse held a vote among the students. Who was least likely to succeed? The results were announced. Gene Hackman and Dustin Hoffman. We were constantly told by acting teachers and casting directors that we were character actors, Gene would later explain. The word character denotes something less than attractive. In other words, they weren't handsome enough. They didn't look like leading men. Gene had a face that looked like it had been reassembled after a bar fight. Dustin had a prominent nose and stood 5'6". In 1950s Hollywood, neither of them fit the mold, but they refused to accept the verdict. After the expulsion, Gene packed his bags and moved to New York. Dustin followed a few months later, showing up at Gene's one-bedroom apartment on 2nd Avenue and 26th Street with $50 in his pocket and nowhere else to go. Gene offered to let me stay a few nights, Dustin recalled, but I wouldn't leave. Dustin slept on the kitchen floor. The apartment was tiny. There was a stove with a board over it for counter space. Next to the stove was a tub that doubled as a sink, also with a board over it. The toilet was next to the bathtub. Dustin would take baths while Gene and his wife Faye made breakfast 3 feet away. All he's thinking about, Dustin said, is that when I had to have my morning bathroom, I didn't care whether they were making eggs or not. He's held that against me for 40 years. Gene finally dragged Dustin out to look for his own apartment. He persuaded him to move in with another struggling actor they'd met, Robert Duvall, who had a 6th-floor walk-up on West 109th Street. The three of them, Gene, Dustin, and Bobby, would become the most successful class of roommates in Hollywood history. 19 Oscar nominations between them, 5 wins. But in 1958, they were nobody. Gene worked as a doorman at Howard Johnson's in Times Square, wearing a ridiculous white uniform with green piping. One day, an instructor from the Pasadena Playhouse walked by, recognized him, and stopped. "Well, well, Hackman," the instructor smiled. "I always knew you wouldn't amount to anything, and here's the proof." Gene didn't respond. He just opened the door. Another day, a Marine recruiting sergeant from Gene's past walked by. He stopped, leaned in close, and said, "Hackman, you're a sorry son of a bitch." Gene stood at that door for hours after, thinking about quitting, thinking about going home, thinking about everything the Pasadena Playhouse had told him. But he didn't quit. It was more psychological warfare, Gene would later tell Vanity Fair. "Because I wasn't going to let those fuckers get me down." Gene and Dustin auditioned for everything: off-Broadway plays, television commercials, bit parts in shows nobody watched. They were rejected more times than they could count. They worked odd jobs during the day and rehearsed at night. On the rooftop of their apartment building, they still played drums sometimes, just like they had at the Playhouse, still dreaming of Brando. In 1967, 11 years after the Pasadena Playhouse voted them least likely to succeed, everything changed. Gene Hackman was cast as Buck Barrow in Bonnie and Clyde. It was a supporting role, but he made it unforgettable. The critics noticed. The Academy noticed. Gene Hackman, the man with no talent, was nominated for an Oscar. The same year, Dustin Hoffman was cast as Benjamin Braddock in The Graduate. It was supposed to be a small film. It became a cultural phenomenon. Dustin Hoffman, The character actor with the wrong face became a movie star overnight. Two men who had been voted least likely to succeed, both nominated for Academy Awards in the same year. Gene didn't win that night, neither did Dustin, but they had proven something, not to the world, to themselves. 4 years later, Gene Hackman won Best Actor for The French Connection. He stood on that stage at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, holding the Oscar, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he heard the voices from the Pasadena Playhouse. Not having talent, least likely to succeed. The Oscar in his hands was his answer. In 1988, Gene was nominated again for Mississippi Burning. He lost. The winner was Dustin Hoffman for Rain Man. Gene wasn't upset. How could he be? His best friend from the rooftop in Pasadena, the kid who'd slept on his kitchen floor, had beaten him. They'd both proven the Playhouse wrong. That was all that mattered. In 1992, Gene won his second Oscar for Unforgiven. He beat Jack Nicholson and Al Pacino. The doorman from Howard Johnson's, the man who was told he'd never amount to anything, had beaten two of the biggest names in Hollywood. But through all of it, through all the awards and the fame and the decades of success, Gene and Dustin never made a movie together. They'd been friends for nearly 50 years. They'd played drums on rooftops. They'd shared apartments. They'd struggled through the worst years of their lives side by side. But they'd never shared a scene. In 2003, that finally changed. Runaway Jury was a John Grisham adaptation about a high-stakes legal battle. Gene played Rankin Fitch, a jury consultant. Dustin played Wendell Rohr, the opposing attorney. They were on opposite sides of the courtroom, just as they'd been on opposite sides of nothing for 47 years. When the crew found out that Gene and Dustin had been friends since 1956, but had never acted together, they were stunned. The director went to the writer and said, "We don't have a scene for them together." The writer said, "Okay, we're going to write one." They created a bathroom scene. Rohr confronts Fitch, two old enemies, two old friends. The first dialogue ever filmed between Gene Hackman and Dustin Hoffman. The scene was shot on a single day at the end of production. Weeks after both actors had finished their other work, they came back to the set just for this, just to finally share a scene after 47 years. When they finished filming, Gene turned to Dustin and said 2 words, "Let's get drunk." They did. Gene Hackman retired from acting in 2004. His last film was Welcome to Mooseport. He moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, with his wife, Betsy. He wrote novels. He avoided Hollywood. He never made another movie. Dustin Hoffman kept acting, but he never forgot the man who had taken him in when he had nothing. The man who had played drums with him on a rooftop in Pasadena. The man who had refused to accept what the world told them both. On February 18, 2025, Gene Hackman died at his home in Santa Fe. He was 95 years old. 10 days later, Dustin Hoffman released a statement. "I met Gene in acting school at the Pasadena Playhouse when he was 27 and I was 19. We used to play congas together on the roof, trying to be like our hero Marlon Brando." He paused. Then he said what he'd been waiting 47 years to say publicly. And Gene was like Brando, in that he brought something unprecedented to our craft, something people didn't immediately understand as genius. He was expelled from our school after 3 months for not having talent. It was the first time they ever did that. Dustin smiled. He was that good. He added, "Powerful, subtle, brilliant. A giant among actors. I miss him already." The Pasadena Playhouse is still standing. It's still producing actors. And somewhere in its archives is a record of the vote from 1956. The vote that named Gene Hackman and Dustin Hoffman the students least likely to succeed. Between them, they won 4 Academy Awards. They were nominated 13 times. They appeared in over 150 films. They changed American cinema forever, and they did it together, not as co-stars, but as friends. Two young men on a rooftop, playing drums, dreaming of Brando, refusing to believe what everyone told them. That's the story of Gene Hackman and Dustin Hoffman. Not the Oscars, not the fame, the friendship, the stubbornness, the refusal to quit when everyone said they should. Least likely to succeed. They heard those words in 1956, and they spent the next 69 years proving them wrong, together, until the very end. There's a photograph somewhere. It's from that rooftop in Pasadena. Two young men, barely visible in the darkness, hunched over their drums. You can't see their faces clearly. You can't hear the music they're playing. But if you look closely, you can see something in the way they're leaning toward each other. Something that looks like determination. Something that looks like hope. They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know about the Oscars or the fame or the 47 years of friendship. They didn't know that one day people would write about them, talk about them, remember them. All they knew was the rhythm of the drums, the lights of Los Angeles in the distance, and the voice in their heads that said, "You're not good enough. You'll never make it. You're the least likely to succeed." They heard that voice every day for years, and every day they chose not to listen. That's the real lesson of Gene Hackman and Dustin Hoffman. Not that talent wins, not that hard work pays off. Those things are true, but they're not the whole story. The real lesson is simpler. When someone tells you that you can't, the only response that matters is, "Watch me." Gene Hackman spent his entire life saying those two words. To the Marine who called him a sorry son of a bitch. To the instructor who said he'd never amount to anything. To the Pasadena Playhouse that expelled him for having no talent. Watch me. He said it with every role, every performance, every award. And when he finally retired, when he walked away from Hollywood on his own terms, he said it one last time. Not with words, with silence. 20 years of silence, living in Santa Fe, writing novels, refusing to play the game anymore. Watch me leave. On my terms, just like I did everything else. That's Gene Hackman. That's the man Dustin Hoffman loved like a brother. That's the friend who changed his life on a rooftop in 1956. A giant among actors, Dustin said. He was talking about Gene's talent, but he could have been talking about something else. His heart, his stubbornness, his absolute refusal to let the bastards win. The Pasadena Playhouse voted Gene Hackman least likely to succeed. He spent 69 years proving them wrong, and he never stopped. Not once, not ever.